Okay, so hopefully you took the survey. So what do you notice? What's odd about these is they more or less look like they should. We get this S-shaped logistic kind of shape, but the carrying capacity is 100, and these guys only got to 50. And so that's the negative effect of competition. By stealing resources from one another, they actually reduce their population size such that the total between the two is actually 100 rather than each of them getting 100 on their own. Right? You could think of it like they have to divide up the resource pie, and they each get half, so their populations are half the size. And so that's one of the effects of competition. But there's something odd here in that this model doesn't actually tell us that much about resource competition, right? You can imagine we've sort of encapsulated all the interactions in these two letters, A and B, right? A better model might have a third equation that tells us about what the resource dynamics are and how those go into the plant population. And so, in fact, this is what ecologists often do, right? As populations grow, they lower the amount of resources in the environment, and what we can look for is there's a resource amount where population growth rate is going to be 0, and that as plants approach their carrying capacity, they're going to have drawn the resources down to that level. So imagine that we could make a graph of the amount of resource 1 in the environment and the amount of resource 2 in the environment. So that's what I've done here. It says 2 on both, but 1 and 2. That's a typo. Right, so if these are essential resources, there is an amount of resource 1 that if the plant draws it to that level, there's going to be 0 growth. And there's an amount of resource 2 that if the plant draws it to that, there's going to be 0 population growth. And from these 2 points, we can draw this sort of square line, which is called the zero net growth isoline, or ZINGI for short. And all this is doing is this graph is describing possible soil types you could imagine, or possible environments. So outside of these 2 lines, we have environments where there's going to be positive population growth because there's lots and lots of resources. And as the populations grow, they're going to draw it down to here, and when they get here, they'll be at their carrying capacity and they can't grow anymore. But there's also a set of environments where there's going to be negative population growth, right? These are environments where the population can't possibly persist. And so essential resources create these sort of square-shaped ZINGIs, these square-shaped zero net growth isoclines, because you can't substitute one for the other, right? It's a straight line, and it's a straight line. Substitutable resources create these sort of diagonal single lines, right? So you could imagine there's an amount of resource 1 in the environment that's going to be useful. Maybe this is the amount of nitrate that you can have, and this is the amount of ammonium you could have if there was no nitrate. But you can substitute anywhere along this line, right? So I could have, maybe 50-50, or I could have 75-25, or 25-75, and because they're substitutable, that's okay. So it's the same as before. This graph describes a bunch of possible different environments. Out here, we have environments with net positive population growth rate, and as the populations grow, they'll draw the resources down until they hit this line, and then they'll be at their carrying capacity. Below this line are environments with really low amounts of resource such that the population can't even establish. So the idea then is that linking population growth to resource level gives us more predictive power than the simple modified logistic equation that we had where we added that extra fractional term, right? So it's cool because now we can actually predict which environments will support populations and which ones won't based on the resource levels, right? So and we'll talk more about this when we get to the definition of ecological niche, which I believe is coming on Friday's lecture. What's cool is that we can also use this idea of ZINGIs, or consumer resource models, to examine competition among populations of different species that have different resource requirements. So imagine that this is showing you the amount of light that might be in the environment and the amount of nitrogen in the environment. And we know that the minimum amount of light that species 1 needs is here, and the minimum amount of nitrogen that it needs is here, and that gives us our square essential resource zero net growth isocline, or ZINGI. Well, we have a second species maybe that is a little more shade tolerant, right? So it can handle darker environments, but it needs more nitrogen to make its photosynthetic apparatus work well in the shade. So it gets this square ZINGI like out here. And so what do we know about these ZINGIs? Well, we know that anything on this side of them is where positive population growth occurs, and anything on this side is where negative population growth occurs. But we have these funny spaces in between, right? And these are useful for thinking about how species interaction occurs, right? So here, if we're going this way, well, species 1 is going to be able to outcompete species 2. It'll outlast species 2. So as they both are drawing resources down, if they end up in this space, well, species 2 is going to get negative population growth. And the same thing would happen here in reverse, right? Here's where species 2 is able to outcompete species 1. Down here below the two zingies in this kind of W-shaped area is where everybody dies because there's not enough light or nitrogen for anybody to persist. And then what's cool is you get this region out here where both populations can potentially grow and potentially coexist, forming a community. Remember, we're on the road to communities in this lecture. And we could do the same thing for substitutable resources, right? So you could imagine that maybe species 1 needs this much nitrate if it's the only thing that you're giving it, and it needs this much ammonium if that's the only form of nitrogen, and any mixture of the two along this line. Maybe species 2 has a slightly different requirement. It maybe needs more ammonium if that's all you're going to give it, but less nitrate if that's all you're going to give it. And we get the same thing as before, right? Below the two lines in this kind of funny space, everybody dies. There's just not enough nitrogen for anyone. Above the two lines, we get this cool thing where potentially both populations might be able to grow and they might be able to coexist. And then we get these regions in between the two lines where here species 2 is able to draw the resources to a level that species 1 can't tolerate. It's below species 1. And here the opposite happens. And this creates what's known as the competitive exclusion principle. The idea is that if you have two species that compete for the exact same resources, they probably can't stably coexist unless they use resources differently. This is the competitive exclusion principle. Right, so here's an example where the two species use resources differently and they can potentially coexist in a narrow range of environments out here. And so there's the old dude, Georgy Gause, in the 1930s, actually tested this. It's a really simple theory, but it makes testable hypotheses. And so in the laboratory, he created models using paramecia species, where he either grew them separately in these black lines. And you can see that they grew logistically, so the cells divided in test tubes over time. And then he put them into mixed populations, and what he saw was that Paramecium aurelia was actually able to drive Paramecium caudatum extinct by basically consuming resources. Unfortunately, this type of experiment is a lot harder to do in nature outside of a test tube. The problem is that many plants are essentially immortal. You know, they reproduce for decades or even hundreds of years. And most of the best examples of competitive exclusion actually use animals, because animals die easy, they don't live very long, they're really fragile. But we can come back to, remember the parked grass experiment. This is that funny experiment that's been going since the 1850s, right? And we can take a look at what's going on with these graphs that we looked at to think about why plant populations don't grow forever. And what we see is that we see something maybe a little bit similar to Gauss's paramecium experiments, where it's possible that this species is going extinct and this species is increasing, and these two species are able to coexist. All right, so this was a big lecture, but there's not that much that we covered, right? So what is competition? What are the different types and mechanisms of competition? How does competition change plant allocation compared to when they grow alone? This is that game theory part. We talked a bit about allelopathy. We talked about resources and different kinds of resources, and we talked about the competitive exclusion principle. And I don't know why it's not on here, but you might be shown graphs of zingies and be asked where populations are growing or shrinking or what might be happening. So try to pay attention to those zingies. I don't know why that's not on here.